At 7:28 p.m. on the 10th of May 2008, a tornado touched down just south of the town of Atkins, Arkansas. The National Weather Service had issued a tornado warning for Pope County 11 minutes earlier. At 7:17 p.m. that warning was based on radar-indicated rotation in a severe thunderstorm moving northeast at 45 miles per hour. The storm had already produced tornadoes earlier that evening in Oklahoma and had crossed into Arkansas with a history of violent behavior. Residents of Atkins had been under a severe thunderstorm watch since early afternoon. The sky had turned a sickly green, the air was heavy and still. At 7:24 p.m. the storm passed over the Arkansas River near the town of Dover. Radar showed a pronounced hook echo. That signature is a classic indicator of a tornado on the ground. The warning was updated to include the area east of Atkins, but by then the tornado was already descending into the valley. The first sign of trouble came from the south side of town. A resident later told reporters he saw a rotating funnel cloud descend from the base of a dark, nearly black wall cloud. It was not a huge tornado. It was narrow, maybe 400 yards wide at its peak, but it was densely packed with debris. The National Weather Service would later rate it an EF2 on the enhanced Fujita scale, with winds estimated at 130 miles per hour. That is not a rare event in Arkansas, but it is more than enough to kill. At 7:28 p.m., the tornado crossed Interstate 40 just west of the Atkins exit. It tore through a mobile home park. Mobile homes are particularly vulnerable to tornadoes because they are not anchored to a foundation and offer little structural protection against high winds. The tornado lifted the homes off their supports, rolled them, and scattered their contents across a quarter-mile field. Inside one of those homes, a family of 4 was huddled in a bathtub. They had no basement. They had no storm shelter. They had heard the sirens. The sirens had sounded in Atkins at 7:18 p.m., about 10 minutes before impact. But the sirens in the outlying areas near the river were on a different activation schedule. They were not triggered until the tornado was already visible. In the mobile home park, the sirens were audible, but the family had no time to reach a safer location. The nearest public shelter was 2 miles away. They did the only thing they could. They covered themselves with a mattress and waited. The tornado passed over them in less than 30 seconds. The house disintegrated. The mattress was torn away. 2 of the 4 were killed instantly. The other 2 were critically injured and would die in the hospital within hours. In total, 5 people died in Atkins that evening. More than 40 were injured. The tornado did not stop there. It continued northeast for another 11 miles, tearing through rural farmlands, destroying barns, flipping vehicles, and uprooting trees. It finally lifted near the community of Pottsville at 7:46 p.m., but the damage was done. What happened in Atkins that night was not a surprise to meteorologists. The conditions were textbook for a severe tornado outbreak. A strong upper-level disturbance moving across the Central Plains, a warm, moist air mass from the Gulf of Mexico, a dry line pushing eastward into Arkansas. Wind shear values were extreme. The Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk for severe weather on the morning of May 10th. Their outlook mentioned the possibility of strong tornadoes across the region. By early afternoon, that moderate risk had been upgraded to a high risk for parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. Atkins was just inside the southern edge of that high-risk zone. The National Weather Service in Little Rock issued a tornado watch at 1:55 p.m. That watch meant conditions were favorable for tornadoes. It was not a warning. The distinction matters. By 7 p.m., the storm was producing supercells with persistent rotation. Doppler radar in Fort Smith detected a strong mesocyclone about 30 miles west of Atkins. The lead time was roughly 30 minutes. That is enough time to warn a community. The National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Pope County at 7:17 p.m. That warning included specific language. A confirmed tornado was on the ground and approaching Atkins. It urged residents to take cover immediately. But how many people received that warning? In 2008, cell phone alerts did not yet exist. The emergency broadcast system could interrupt television and radio, but only if the station chose to carry the alert. Many people did not have their televisions on. Some were eating dinner, some were driving home from work. The sirens were the primary method of outdoor warning in Atkins. They were activated by the County Emergency Management Office. The decision to sound the sirens came after the warning was issued. But the sirens in the southern part of the county, where the mobile home park was located, were on a separate system. They were not activated until a spotter reported the tornado on the ground at 7:24 p.m. That gave residents in the path approximately 4 minutes of warning. 4 minutes is not nothing. It can be enough time to get to a basement or a storm shelter. But the mobile home park had no basement. The nearest shelter was at a church 2 miles away. That is a 10-minute drive. The residents who survived either ran to a neighbor's house with a basement or they happened to be away from home. Many others simply did not believe the warning was real. A pattern of false alarms in previous years had bred complacency. The sirens had sounded multiple times that spring with no tornado. Residents told reporters later that they had learned to ignore them. That is a problem that is not unique to Atkins. It is a national problem, but in a town where most homes are single-story and without basements, ignoring the siren can be fatal. The National Weather Service conducted a damage survey the next morning. They measured the path length, the width, and the damage indicators. They found that the tornado reached EF2 intensity near the mobile home park. They found that many of the homes that were destroyed had not been built to any wind resistance standard. Mobile homes in Arkansas are required to have tie-down straps, but enforcement is inconsistent. The tornado did not need to be a strong EF4 to cause catastrophic damage. It only needed to be strong enough to flip a manufactured home. Investigators also looked at the warning chain. They asked why the county sirens were not activated immediately when the warning was issued. The answer was procedural. The county emergency manager had to confirm the threat before sounding the siren. That confirmation came from a trained storm spotter who was positioned along the interstate. That spotter saw the tornado at 7:24 p.m. The siren was sounded at 7:25 p.m. By then, the tornado was less than 3 miles away. At 45 miles per hour, that is a 4-minute lead time. It is an improvement over no warning, but it is not enough for a community with no shelters. The question that lingers is whether more people could have been saved. The answer is complicated. If the sirens had been activated at 7:17 p.m. when the warning was issued, residents would have had 11 minutes. That is enough time to gather a family, get in a car, and drive to a shelter. But that depends on the shelter being open, on the roads being clear, on people not hesitating. It also depends on the sirens being heard indoors. Many homes in Atkins are not close to a siren. They rely on weather radios or television. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had a program to distribute weather radios to rural communities. Atkins had participated, but not every household had one, and not every radio that had one was on the right frequency. In the years following the Atkins tornado, the National Weather Service worked with Pope County to improve the siren activation protocol. They implemented a policy that allowed sirens to be sounded immediately upon a warning being issued, without waiting for spotter confirmation. They also funded a study on the effectiveness of mobile home park warnings. That study found that the most effective intervention was not a siren, but a designated shelter within a half-mile of the park. That is expensive. It requires land, construction, maintenance. Many towns cannot afford it. Atkins is a small town of about 3,000 people. Its budget is limited. The tornado changed the conversation about shelter access in the region, but it did not create a new funding stream. The people who died in Atkins on May 10, 2008 were not statistics. They had names: a young mother, a retired carpenter, 2 children under the age of 10. They did not die because they were reckless. They died because the warning system had gaps, because the housing was vulnerable, and because the time between the warning and the impact was measured in minutes, not hours. The tornado itself was a natural event, but the deaths were not inevitable. They were the result of a series of decisions, procedures, and infrastructure limitations that aligned in the worst possible way. This story is not only about one tornado. It is about the layers of protection that we assume exist and the ways they can fail. Doppler radar detects rotation. Meteorologists issue warnings. Sirens sound. People take cover. But each layer depends on the next. If the warning is delayed, or the siren does not reach, or the shelter is too far, the system breaks. The Atkins tornado exposed these breaks in a way that is still relevant today. Over 15 years later, tornado warning technology has improved. Smartphones now push alerts automatically. The social media ecosystem can spread information faster than ever. Even the EF scale has been updated. But the fundamental problem remains. The most vulnerable people often live in the most vulnerable structures with the least warning time. And no app can fix that. The investigation into the Atkins tornado did not produce a single dramatic cause. There was no mechanical failure, no deliberate act. There was only a storm that arrived at the wrong time in the wrong place and a community that was not as prepared as it could have been. The National Weather Service report is thorough. It lists the timeline, the damage, the recommendations. But it does not bring back the 5 people who died. It does not erase the memory of the siren that sounded too late. It does not give the survivors a way to forget the sound of the wind. What happened in Atkins is a reminder that tornadoes are not just weather events. They are tests of the systems we build to protect ourselves. And sometimes the systems fail. The reasons why are worth examining, because the next tornado will arrive somewhere at some time, and the difference between life and death may again come down to a few minutes, a siren, a warning, a choice. The Atkins tornado happened on the 10th of May 2008, but the questions it raised have not been fully answered. They are still being asked today. At 7:35 p.m. on May 10, 2008, the first search and rescue teams arrived in the mobile home park. The tornado had passed. The sky was clearing, but the ground was unrecognizable. Mobile homes were flipped, stacked, folded. Trees were stripped of bark. Vehicles were tossed into piles. The first responders came from the Pope County Sheriff's Office, the Atkins Volunteer Fire Department, and the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management. They had no power, no working phones, no street signs. They navigated by debris and memory. What they found were not bodies but fragments. The tornado had torn the park apart with such force that some victims were never found in one piece. Search dogs were brought in. Thermal imaging cameras scanned the wreckage. By midnight, all 5 fatalities had been recovered. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 62. 2 of the victims were carried more than 100 feet from where their homes had stood. The NWS later determined that wind speeds in the park peaked at 130 miles per hour. That is the lower end of EF3 range. But the construction of the homes did not require that level of wind resistance. The deaths were not from the wind directly. They were from blunt force trauma, debris impact, structural collapse. The survivors were taken to local churches and schools. A Red Cross shelter opened at the Atkins High School gymnasium. By dawn, more than 300 people had registered as displaced. Many had lost everything: clothing, documents, medication, pets. The community response was immediate and generous. Donations poured in from surrounding counties. Volunteers arrived with chainsaws, bottled water, and tarps. But the emotional toll was slow to surface. A pastor from a nearby church told reporters that the first night the survivors were silent. They sat in rows on cots, staring at nothing. No one spoke about what they had seen. That came later. A week after the tornado, the Arkansas governor declared a state of emergency for Pope County. FEMA arrived to assess damage. They approved individual assistance for residents whose homes were destroyed. But the process was slow. Many residents did not have insurance. Mobile home insurance in 2008 was often optional. Even those who carried it found that policies did not cover wind damage from tornadoes. The fine print excluded what they called an act of God. The families were left to rebuild with savings, loans, or charity. The mobile home park was never rebuilt. The land was cleared and left empty. A memorial bench was installed near the entrance. It bears the names of the 5 who died. The system failures that the Atkins tornado exposed were not new to meteorologists. They had been known for decades. A 1999 study by the National Severe Storms Laboratory found that mobile home residents are 4 times more likely to die in a tornado than residents of site-built homes. That statistic was cited in training materials. It was discussed at conferences, but it did not translate into policy. In 2008, the state of Arkansas had no requirement that mobile home parks provide storm shelters. Federal guidelines existed, but they were recommendations, not mandates. The mobile home park in Atkins had been built in the 1970s. It had no designated shelter. The nearest public shelter was at a church 2 miles away. That church had a basement. But the distance was insurmountable with a 4-minute warning. After the Atkins tornado, the National Weather Service in Little Rock began a public education campaign focused on mobile home residents. They partnered with the Arkansas Manufactured Housing Association. They distributed flyers with the phrase, "No mobile home is safe in a tornado. Have a plan, nowhere to go, leave early." They hosted community meetings in mobile home parks across the state. They demonstrated how to tie down homes. They showed how to identify a safe structure nearby, but the turnout was low. Residents told the NWS that they had heard the message before. They did not believe they were at risk. Complacency was not just a problem in Atkins, it was a cultural pattern. In 2009, the Arkansas legislature considered a bill that would require new mobile home parks to include a storm shelter. The bill was supported by the NWS and emergency managers. It was opposed by the manufactured housing industry, which argued that the cost would be passed on to renters and would make affordable housing less available. The bill died in committee. A similar bill was introduced in Tuesday Reunion. It also died. The argument in favor of mandates was simple: lives could be saved. The argument against was financial. The industry pointed to the low probability of a tornado hitting any specific park in any given year. They said it was not cost-effective. The problem was that when a tornado did hit, the cost was measured in human life. Meanwhile, the technology for detection continued to improve. In 2010, the National Weather Service upgraded its Doppler radar network to dual polarization. This allowed meteorologists to better distinguish between rain, hail, and debris. It improved the ability to detect tornadoes even when they were wrapped in rain. In 2012, the wireless emergency alert system was launched. Cell phones began to receive tornado warnings automatically with a distinctive sound. That system was not available in 2008. By 2015, surveys showed that wireless alerts had become the fastest way to reach people. But the system had a flaw. It required the user to have a phone. It required the phone to be turned on, and it required the user to understand what the alert meant. In Atkins, the warning problem was not just about technology. It was about trust. The sirens had sounded multiple times that spring with no tornado. The NWS later acknowledged that their tornado warnings were sometimes too broad. They were issued for entire counties, even when the rotation was limited to a small area. This reduced credibility. People in Pope County had heard warnings before and nothing happened. On May 10, 2008, the warning was accurate, but the false alarms from previous months had trained people to wait and see. The NWS studied this phenomenon extensively after Atkins. They began experimenting with more precise wording. They stopped using the phrase tornado warning for every rotation. They tried to reserve it for threats that were confirmed or highly likely. But the human element remained. A warning is only effective if it is believed. Investigators from the NWS and the University of Oklahoma later conducted interviews with survivors from the Atkins mobile home park. They asked why they did not take shelter when the sirens sounded. The answers varied. Some said they did not hear it. Some said they heard it but thought it was a test. Some said they looked outside, saw no funnel, and assumed it was a false alarm. One survivor said she had been through 3 warnings that spring without a tornado. She told the interviewer, "You cannot live in fear every day, you have to function." That statement captures the dilemma. People cannot stay in a storm shelter every time the sky darkens. They have to balance risk with normal life. The tornado that kills is the one that arrives when that balance is wrong. The story of Atkins is not a mystery. There is no unsolved question about what caused the deaths. The cause is understood. It was a moderate-strength tornado hitting a vulnerable population with inadequate warning time and no safe shelter. What remains is the question of why that combination is allowed to persist. Why in a country that invests billions in weather prediction do people still die in mobile homes? The answer is that prediction is only half the equation. The other half is action, and action requires infrastructure, education, and trust. All 3 of those were insufficient on May 10, 2008. Over the next decade, the number of mobile home tornado deaths in the United States declined slightly. This was due in part to better warning technology. But it was also due to a statistical shift. More tornadoes were hitting fewer mobile homes. The number of mobile homes in tornado-prone areas actually increased. The risk did not go away, it moved. In 2011, a tornado in Joplin, Missouri killed 161 people. That tornado was an EF5. It destroyed entire neighborhoods, including site-built homes, but in the mobile home parks of Joplin, the death rate was disproportionately high. The same pattern appeared again in 2014 in Vilonia, Arkansas. An EF4 tornado destroyed a mobile home park. 11 people died. The same questions were asked. The same recommendations were made. The same bills were introduced. The same industry opposition emerged. In Atkins, the legacy is not in policy changes that were passed. It is in the lessons that were missed. The NWS report from 2008 is still available online. It contains a detailed timeline, a list of damage indicators, and a set of recommendations. One recommendation is that mobile home parks should be required to provide a shelter. Another is that siren activation should be automated to reduce delay. Another is that public education should be continuous, not just during tornado season. 15 years later, none of those recommendations have been implemented universally. Some counties adopted them voluntarily, most did not. The reason is cost. The price of a concrete storm shelter for a single park can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. The price of a life is harder to calculate. The National Weather Service did what it could. They improved the warning process. They made it easier for emergency managers to trigger sirens. They created a new product called a tornado emergency reserved for the most severe threats. They added impact-based warnings that describe the expected damage. They started including specific language. This is a life-threatening situation. But those changes did not fix the fundamental gap. A warning is just a message. It does not build a shelter. It does not make a mobile home safe. It does not give a family the ability to leave work early and drive to a church basement. On the 10th anniversary of the Atkins tornado, a memorial service was held at the site of the park. About 60 people attended. They placed flowers on the bench. They read the names. The mayor gave a speech about resilience. A survivor stood up and said that she still could not sleep during thunderstorms. She said that every siren test made her heart race. She said that her children, who were not yet born in 2008, had been taught the drill. As soon as the siren sounds, they go to the interior bathroom. They bring a mattress. They bring a flashlight. They bring a weather radio. She said she had not had a basement built because she could not afford it. She said she relied on the siren. She said the siren still does not always sound in time. The question that the Atkins tornado asks is not technical. It is not about whether radar can detect rotation. It is not about how fast a warning can travel through fiber optic cables. It is about whether a society that can predict a storm can also protect the people who are most exposed to it. The answer as of 2008 was no. The answer as of 2023 is still not a full yes. Progress has been made, but it has been incremental, and the people who live in mobile homes are still waiting. They are not waiting for a better radar. They are waiting for a door that leads down, not out. The Atkins tornado was not a disaster of nature alone. It was a disaster of systems. The storm arrived, the warnings were issued, the sirens sounded. But the lines between those events were too long. The time between the warning and the impact was too short. The distance to a safe place was too far. The combination was fatal. The names of the 5 who died are carved in stone. The lessons are still being learned. The next tornado will test them again, and the answer will depend on whether those lessons have been applied or forgotten. The Atkins tornado did not end with the cleanup. In the weeks that followed, the National Weather Service sent a team of meteorologists and social scientists to the town. They conducted what is called a service assessment. They interviewed survivors, first responders, and local officials. They reviewed radar data, warning logs, and dispatch tapes. They wanted to know not just what happened, but why the warnings had not saved more lives. The report they published in 2009 runs more than 50 pages. It is a document that is both technical and human. It contains radar imagery, damage photographs, and transcripts of radio communications. It also contains the words of people who lost family members. One section titled Public Response includes this quote from a survivor of the mobile home park. "I heard the siren, I thought it was a test. I went outside to check the sky, it looked normal, then I heard the roar, I ran to the bathtub, I made it, my neighbor did not." The report identified three main failures. The first was warning timing, the second was public understanding, the third was the lack of a safe place to go. The NWS team noted that the warning lead time, while within the national average, was insufficient for a mobile home park. People in site-built homes could get to a basement or interior room in seconds. People in mobile homes had no such option. They had to leave the structure entirely and seek shelter elsewhere. That required time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The report recommended that the NWS work with emergency managers to develop a mobile home park protocol. This would include automated siren activation for any tornado warning that threatened a park, regardless of the storm's exact path. It also recommended that mobile home parks be required to post the location of the nearest community shelter and conduct regular tornado drills. Neither recommendation was mandated at the federal level. They were left to local jurisdiction. The state of Arkansas took some action. In 2009, the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management began a program to install hardened shelters in mobile home parks. The program was voluntary and grant-funded. It provided up to half the cost of a shelter. The other half had to be covered by the park owner or local government. In the first year, only 3 parks applied. The cost of a concrete shelter capable of holding 50 people was roughly $140,000. For a park owner operating on thin margins, that was prohibitive. For a small town like Atkins, the matching funds were difficult to raise. By 2013, the program had installed shelters in 22 parks across the state, but there were over 500 mobile home parks in Arkansas. The coverage was minimal. The program was later expanded with federal disaster mitigation funds, but it never reached the scale that was needed. Meanwhile, the National Weather Service continued to refine its warnings. In 2012, they introduced a new product called the Tornado Warning with a confirmed tornado. This was not just a rotation detected on radar. It was a visual confirmation from a trained spotter or law enforcement. The idea was to reduce false alarms and increase the credibility of warnings. But this approach had its own problem. By the time a tornado is visually confirmed, it is often too late for people in its path who have not already taken shelter. The Atkins tornado was visually confirmed by a police officer near Appleton, Arkansas, at 6:15 p.m. That was just 9 minutes before it struck the mobile home park. The warning that went out at 6:16 p.m. that was based on radar. The visual confirmation came after the warning was already issued. The NWS team concluded that radar-based warnings, despite their false alarms, remained the only way to provide enough lead time. The key was to make the public understand that a radar-indicated tornado was real, even if a funnel was not visible from the ground. The problem of invisible tornadoes is not unique to Arkansas. In the southeastern United States, many tornadoes are rain-wrapped. They are hidden behind curtains of heavy precipitation. People who look outside see only dark clouds and rain. They do not see a funnel. They assume they are safe. The Atkins tornado was rain-wrapped. It was also a high-precipitation supercell. The rotation was embedded in a larger storm. Even trained spotters had difficulty seeing it. The NWS report noted that the storm's structure made it difficult to issue a warning based on visual cues alone. The warning had to come from radar. And that radar data had to be trusted. But trust is built over time. In Pope County, the high number of false alarms had eroded that trust. The NWS recommended that the local emergency management office conduct public education campaigns each spring. They recommended that the campaigns include the message, "If you hear a siren, take shelter immediately. Do not look outside. Do not wait for confirmation. The tornado may be hidden by rain." In Atkins, the survivors remembered that message, but they did not always follow it. One survivor told the NWS team, "I knew I should go to the shelter, but I thought I had a few more minutes. I wanted to finish putting my dishes away." That statement is not unusual. In many tornado disasters, people delay action because they underestimate the speed of the storm. The average forward speed of a tornado in Arkansas is about 40 miles per hour. That means it can cover a mile in 90 seconds. A delay of 2 minutes can be fatal. The NWS report included a chart showing the time between the siren activation and the tornado impact for each of the 5 victims. The shortest was 3 minutes. The longest was 6. For the victims who died, the siren gave them at best a few minutes to react. For the victims who survived, the siren gave them a similar amount of time, but they were closer to the shelter or they moved faster. The mobile home park in Atkins had a community shelter. It was a concrete building near the entrance of the park. It had been built in the 1990s after a previous tornado threat. It could hold about 60 people. On the evening of May 10, 2008, about 24 people made it to that shelter. They survived. The 5 who died did not. One of the victims, a woman named Linda, lived in a mobile home about 200 feet from the shelter. She was 72 years old. She had lived in the park for 20 years. Her husband had passed away 2 years earlier. She had a hearing aid that she sometimes forgot to put in when she heard the siren. On that day, she had been watching television. The power went out. The siren sounded. She may not have heard it clearly. She got up and started walking toward the shelter, but the storm was already on top of her. The mobile home was lifted and rolled. She was thrown into a ditch. She died of blunt force trauma. Her body was found 30 yards from where her home had stood. Another victim was a man named James. He was 54. He had been a truck driver. He was disabled and used a cane. He lived alone. When the siren sounded, he tried to get to the shelter, but he could not move quickly. The tornado struck before he could reach the door. His mobile home was destroyed. He was found under a piece of debris. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as multiple injuries. The distance from his front door to the shelter was less than 100 yards. It was a distance he could not cover in time. The NWS report included a map of the park with the locations of the victims' homes and the shelter. The distances were short, the times were short, the margin for error was 0. The report concluded that for people with mobility issues, the only safe option was to have a shelter inside or immediately adjacent to their home. The report recommended that all new mobile homes in tornado-prone areas be required to have a safe room or a connection to a community shelter. That recommendation, like many others, was never adopted. The mobile home industry argued that the cost would make housing unaffordable for low-income families. The state legislature did not push the issue. The result was that the most vulnerable people remained the most exposed. In the years after Atkins, the broader conversation about mobile home safety shifted slowly. FEMA updated its guidelines for safe rooms. They provided designs that could be retrofitted into existing mobile homes. The cost of a residential safe room ranged from $3,000 to $8,000. For a family living paycheck to paycheck, that was a large expense. Some states offered grant programs. Arkansas created a safe room rebate program in 2021. It provided up to $3,000 for the construction of a residential safe room. The program was popular. It ran out of funding quickly. In 2012, the program was renewed with additional federal money. By 2016, over 4,000 safe rooms had been installed across the state, but that number represented only a tiny fraction of the households in mobile homes. There were over 300,000 mobile homes in Arkansas. The program, while successful, was not scaled to the size of the problem. The Atkins tornado also influenced research into social vulnerability. Sociologists at the University of Arkansas studied the demographics of the victims and survivors. They found that the mobile home park had a higher than average population of elderly residents and people with disabilities. These were the same groups that were least likely to reach a distant shelter. The study recommended that emergency management agencies prioritize vulnerable populations in their warning and response plans. It also recommended that tornado drills be tailored to specific needs, such as hearing-impaired residents or those with limited mobility. In Atkins, the local emergency manager began a program to distribute NOAA weather radios to every household in the mobile home park. The radios were programmed to turn on automatically for tornado warnings. They could be set to flash a light for people who were hard of hearing. The program was funded by a grant from the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management. It was a small step, but it saved lives. In 2011, a tornado warning was issued for Atkins. The weather radio in the mobile home park turned on at 3 a.m. A family with a young child woke up and went to the shelter. The tornado passed 2 miles north of the park. They were safe. They credited the radio, but the radio program was not universal. Many mobile home parks in rural Arkansas did not have the same resources. The warning system still relied on sirens, which could not be heard indoors by everyone. It relied on television and radio, which required power. It relied on cell phones, which had spotty coverage in some areas. The technological solutions were improving, but they were not evenly distributed. In 2013, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration launched a new initiative called WeatherReady Nation. It aimed to improve the communication and response to severe weather. It included partnerships with mobile home park owners to install weather radios and conduct drills. It also included social science research to understand why people ignore warnings. The findings were sobering. People ignored warnings for a variety of reasons. Some did not trust the source. Some were in denial, some were afraid of the cost of sheltering, some were simply confused by the multiple alert systems. In Atkins, the confusion was about the siren itself. The siren was activated by the Pope County Emergency Management Office. It was a county-wide activation. That meant the sirens sounded for any tornado warning that affected any part of the county, the entire county including areas far from the storm. This created a boy who cried wolf dynamic. People in parts of the county that were not threatened began to dismiss the siren as irrelevant. The NWS recommended that sirens be activated only for warned areas, not entire counties. But that required a level of granularity that many counties did not have. The siren systems were built on old infrastructure. They were not designed for targeted activation. Upgrading them would cost millions. Most counties did not have the budget. The legacy of Atkins is not a single policy change. It is a series of small adjustments that cumulatively improved the system but left the core problem unsolved. The problem is that mobile homes are inherently unsafe in tornadoes. And the people who live in them are often the least able to protect themselves. The solution is not better warnings. The solution is better housing, but that is a slow, expensive, and politically difficult change. In the meantime, the warnings improve. The sirens get faster, the radar gets sharper, the cell phones buzz, but every year tornadoes hit mobile home parks, and every year people die. On May 10, 2008, the death toll was 5. It could have been higher. The park had over 100 residents. The escape to the shelter saved many, but 5 was not 0, and the difference between 5 and 0 was not luck. It was time that was not enough for some. Time that was barely enough for others. The question that remains is how to create more time. How to build a system that gives every person, regardless of their age, their mobility, their income, or their location, enough time to get to safety. The answer is not simple. It requires investment in infrastructure. It requires education that changes behavior. It requires a society that values the lives of its most vulnerable members. The Atkins tornado did not change the world. But it changed the lives of those who survived, and it left a blueprint for what could be done. The question is whether that blueprint will be followed or whether it will sit on a shelf gathering dust until the next storm. Continue directly after the current draft excerpt. In the months following the Atkins tornado, the National Weather Service convened a service assessment team. The team arrived in Pope County on May 15, 2008. They interviewed survivors, emergency managers, meteorologists, and local officials. They reviewed radar data, warning logs, and siren activation records. Their report was released in July 2008. It was 47 pages long. It contained 23 specific recommendations. Among them, improve siren activation criteria to be storm cell specific rather than countywide, require all mobile home parks to have a community shelter within 200 feet of every home, mandate that park owners provide annual tornado drill participation, and fund a statewide program to distribute weather radios to mobile home residents. The report was thorough. It was practical. It was distributed to every county emergency management office in Arkansas. And then, for the most part, it was filed away. The state legislature considered a bill in 2009 that would have required all new mobile home parks to include a storm shelter. The bill was sponsored by a state senator from Faulkner County, just south of Pope County. He had lost a cousin in the Atkins tornado. The bill was opposed by the Arkansas Mobile Home and RV Association. Their lobbyist argued that the cost of shelters would increase lot rents by as much as $50 per month. That would price out low-income families. They also argued that mobile home residents were transient and unlikely to invest in a shelter that would not increase property value. The bill died in committee. A similar bill was introduced in 2009. It also failed. By 2013, the state had passed a voluntary shelter incentive program instead. Parks that installed a shelter received a tax credit. Few parks took advantage of it. Meanwhile, the warnings continued to improve. In 2010, the National Weather Service launched a new experimental product called the Tornado Warning Polygon. Instead of a county-wide warning, the polygon warned only the specific area where the storm would pass. The technology allowed meteorologists to draw a shape on a map that corresponded to the projected path of the storm. The polygon could be as narrow as a few miles wide. In theory, this meant fewer false alarms for people not in the path. In practice, it required emergency managers to update their siren activation procedures. Many did not. The sirens in Pope County still sounded for the entire county. The polygon was used for mobile phone alerts but not for the outdoor sirens. That gap remained a problem. On April 9, 2009, a tornado struck a mobile home park in the town of Mayflower, about 70 miles southeast of Atkins. The storm was an EF2. It destroyed 12 mobile homes. One person was killed. Her name was Sandra. She was 6'3". She was a retired school teacher. She had lived in the park for 11 years. She did not have a car. When the warning came, she tried to walk to the community building, which had a basement. The building was 300 feet away. The tornado crossed the road before she reached it. She was thrown into a drainage ditch. Her body was found the next day. The NWS assessment of that tornado noted that the warning time was 14 minutes, but the shelter was too far. The recommendation from Atkins had not been implemented. The building at Mayflower was not a shelter. It was a meeting hall with windows. The roof collapsed. In 2011, a super outbreak of tornadoes swept across the southeast. Over 300 people died. Hundreds of those deaths were in mobile homes. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration intensified its focus on mobile home safety. A new program called the Integrated Warning Team was piloted in Arkansas. It brought together forecasters, emergency managers, and media to craft consistent, actionable warnings. They tested new language. This is a life-threatening situation. Mobile home residents must leave immediately and go to a sturdy building. That language entered the standard warning text, but it relied on the recipient having a sturdy building nearby. In many rural areas, no such building existed. The Atkins tornado also prompted academic research. A team from the University of Oklahoma studied the warning compliance behavior of mobile home residents in Arkansas. They surveyed 400 residents of mobile home parks in the path of tornadoes between 2008 and 2010. The findings were stark. More than 60% of residents said they did not have a pre-designated shelter location. Nearly 40% said they would not leave their home during a warning because they did not want to leave their pets. Another 30% said they had no transportation. The researchers concluded that warning systems designed for a general population often fail for vulnerable subgroups. The study recommended that mobile home parks be required to provide shelter transportation during warnings. It also recommended that parks allow pets in shelters. By 2013, only a handful of parks in Arkansas had pet-friendly shelter policies. The economic reality of mobile home life was a persistent barrier. Mobile homes are the largest source of unsubsidized affordable housing in the United States. Residents are often elderly, disabled, or low income. They cannot afford to move to a more sturdy home. They cannot afford to retrofit a mobile home with a safe room. And they cannot afford to relocate during every tornado warning. Many simply accept the risk. In interviews, survivors of the Atkins tornado described a fatalistic attitude. They knew the mobile home was dangerous, but they had no choice. One survivor, a grandmother raising 2 grandchildren, said, "I know it's not safe, but where else can I go?" The National Association of Home Builders and the mobile home industry continued to resist mandates. They argued that safe rooms would add $3,000 to $5,000 to the cost of a new mobile home. That price increase, they said, would push thousands of families out of the housing market. They proposed instead that residents voluntarily purchase safe rooms with federal subsidies. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, did provide grants for safe room construction, but the grants were competitive. Not every county applied. Not every county could afford the matching funds. In Pope County, the Safe Room Rebate Program was oversubscribed within 2 months. The waiting list grew to over 100 families. Many of those families were still waiting when the next tornado season began. In 2013, another tornado struck a mobile home park in central Arkansas near the town of Valonia. The storm was an EF2. It destroyed 20 homes, 2 people died. One of the victims was a 72-year-old man who had just moved into the park the week before. He had not yet been told where the shelter was. The shelter was 400 feet away. He did not make it. His daughter later told a reporter he didn't even know there was a shelter. The park manager never told him. That testimony led to a new state law, passed in 2014, requiring mobile home park owners to provide tenants with a written map of shelter locations and a summary of emergency procedures at the time of lease signing. The law also required a drill twice a year. The penalties for noncompliance were a fine of $100 per violation. The law was a small step, but it carried no enforcement mechanism. The state had no inspector to verify that park owners had provided the information. The law was largely symbolic. In 2015, the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management conducted a review of all mobile home park emergency plans. They found that only 30% of parks had a written plan that met the minimum standards. The rest had either no plan or a plan that was outdated or incomplete. The department recommended that all parks be required to submit a plan annually. The legislature did not act. By 2016, the pattern was clear. The warnings had improved, the radar had improved, the communication had improved, but the physical infrastructure of mobile home parks had not improved. The shelters were still too far, the mobile homes were still unanchored, the residents were still vulnerable. The Atkins tornado had been a tragedy. It had also been a lesson, but the lesson had not been fully learned. On May 1, 2017, a tornado warning was issued for Pope County. The storm was an E-phone. It passed directly over the same mobile home park that had been hit in 2008. This time, every resident was in the shelter. The siren had been activated. The weather radios had turned on. The park manager had driven through the park with a bullhorn. The shelter was full. No one was injured. The tornado destroyed 6 mobile homes, but everyone survived. The park manager told reporters, "We learned from 2008. We drill every month. We don't take any chances." That was a success, but it was a success born of experience, not of policy. The same experience had not been shared by every park. In 2018, a tornado struck a mobile home park in the Arkansas River Valley. The storm was an EF3. It killed 4 people. The park had no shelter. The nearest sturdy building was a gas station half a mile away. The residents had no car. They huddled in their bathtubs. 2 of the bodies were found in bathtubs. The rest were found in the debris. The question that lingers is not what caused the Atkins tornado. The cause is well understood: a supercell thunderstorm, a strong low-level jet, high instability. The question is why the same failures recur year after year. The answer is not meteorological. It is systemic. It is about money. It is about political will. It is about the value society places on the lives of those who live on the margins. In 2021, the National Transportation Safety Board released a study on the safety of mobile homes in tornadoes. They concluded that the current building code, HUD code, does not require mobile homes to withstand the winds of even an iPhone tornado. The standard is only 100 miles per hour. Most tornadoes exceed that. The board recommended that HUD update the code to require wind resistance of at least 130 miles per hour. The mobile home industry opposed the change. They argued that it would increase costs by 15%. The HUD code was not updated. Today, the Atkins tornado is not widely remembered. It does not appear in the history books. It does not have a documentary film. The mobile home park has been rebuilt. A new shelter was added, funded by a FEMA grant. It stands just 50 feet from the nearest homes. The park manager now gives every new tenant a map. The weather radio is provided. The drills are held every spring. The families who live there now are not the same families as 2008, but they are the same kind of families: low income, elderly, disabled. They live in a vulnerable structure because they have no other option. The story of Atkins is not a story of one storm. It is a story of a system that produces vulnerable housing, then tries to protect it with warnings that are not fast enough and shelters that are not close enough. The system has improved, but not enough. The gap between the recommendation and the reality remains wide. The next tornado will find that gap, someone will die, and afterward another report will be written, another recommendation will be made, and another family will wonder why nothing changed. On February 5, 2008 at 7:14 p.m. a tornado warning was issued for Pope County. The warning was based on a radar-indicated mesocyclone. The storm was moving east at 45 miles per hour. The warning was sent to the siren system. The siren activated at 7:15 p.m. that gave the residents of the Atkins trailer court exactly 3 minutes before the tornado struck. 3 minutes was not enough for everyone, but it was enough for most. The question that remains is, how many more minutes can the system provide, and what will it take to make sure that every person, regardless of their circumstances, has enough time to reach safety? The Atkins tornado did not answer that question, it only asked it, and the answer 16 years later is still being written. At 7:17 p.m. on February 5, 2008, the first reports of damage began reaching the Pope County Sheriff's Office. The callers were frantic. They described overturned mobile homes, twisted metal, and people trapped under debris. The dispatcher relayed the information to the emergency manager. The tornado had been on the ground for less than 10 minutes, but the damage path was already being mapped by storm spotters. The initial assessment was grim. The trailer court had been hit directly. At least 13 people were dead. The number would later be revised to 14. What happened in those final minutes inside the mobile homes is not fully known. No survivor from the direct impact zone could describe the last moments, but investigators reconstructed the likely scenario. The tornado struck with winds estimated at 165 miles per hour. That is enough to lift a mobile home off its foundation, toss it into the air, and shred it. The homes that remained were unrecognizable. The frames were bent, the walls were torn open, the roofs were gone. The bodies were found in the debris, often several yards from where the home had stood. Some were found in the open fields. They had been thrown from their homes. The coroner worked through the night. The victims ranged in age from 6 months to 83 years old. The youngest was a baby girl. The oldest was a retired farmer who had lived in the park for 20 years. The cause of death for most was blunt force trauma. The preliminary report noted that none of the victims had been in a safe room. The nearest storm shelter was a quarter mile away. It had been built in 2006 after a series of near misses, but the distance mattered. When the warning came, there was not enough time. The Red Cross set up a shelter at the local high school. The displaced residents arrived with nothing. Many had lost everything. The insurance adjusters arrived within days. The claims were processed. But the payouts were small. Most residents carried only liability insurance. They did not have replacement cost coverage. The mobile homes were old, the value was low, the average payout was less than $5,000. That was not enough to buy a new home. Some families moved in with relatives, others left the state. The trailer court was closed for 2 months, the debris was cleared, the land was graded. The park reopened in April, but many of the original residents were gone. The state legislature held a hearing in March 2008. The topic was tornado preparedness in mobile home parks. The hearings were emotional. Family members of the victims testified. They described the lack of warning, the distance to the shelter, the confusion over the siren. One mother said she had called 911 after the siren went off, but the dispatcher told her to stay put. She stayed. She died. Another survivor testified that the park manager had never held a drill. The manager, who had been in the park during the tornado, survived by hiding in a bathtub. He said the warnings had been inadequate. He said he had asked the county for a closer shelter. The county said there was no funding. The hearing led to a bill. It required all mobile home parks with more than 20 units to have a written emergency plan and to conduct an annual drill. It also required the park owner to post a map of the shelter location in a common area. The bill passed unanimously. It was signed into law in April 2008, but the law had no funding. The state did not provide money for shelters. The parks that could not afford a shelter were still vulnerable. The law did not require a shelter. It only required a plan. In 2009, the Federal Emergency Management Agency released a report on the Atkins tornado. The report was based on interviews with survivors, emergency managers, and meteorologists. It concluded that the warning system had performed well, but the lead time was insufficient. The report recommended that mobile home parks install sirens inside the park, that weather radios be provided to all residents, and that safe rooms be built within 200 feet of every home. The report also noted that most mobile homes in the park had no anchor system. The tie-down straps were rusted or missing. The homes were simply sitting on concrete blocks. The report called for stronger enforcement of HUD standards for tie-downs. None of the recommendations were mandatory. The mobile home industry opposed any new regulations. The state argued that compliance would be too expensive for park owners. The federal government declined to impose new rules. The report was filed. It was read by emergency managers. It was cited in later studies, but it did not change the law. The years passed. The memory of Atkins faded, but the underlying conditions remained. In 2010, a tornado struck a mobile home park in Mississippi. 10 people died. In 2011, a tornado struck a mobile home park in Alabama. 26 people died. In 2012, a tornado struck a mobile home park in Oklahoma. 5 people died. The pattern was consistent. The warning technology improved. The lead times increased. The number of mobile home parks grew. The number of shelters did not. The death toll in mobile homes remained disproportionately high. In 2015, the National Weather Service conducted a survey of mobile home parks in tornado-prone states. They found that only 1 in 4 parks had a storm shelter. Of those with shelters, the average distance from the homes was 400 feet. That is a 5-minute walk. The average lead time for a tornado warning is 13 minutes, but the warning comes after the storm is already on the ground. The time to reach the shelter must include the time to get out of the home, to cross the street, to open the shelter door. For an elderly person or a person with disabilities, that time doubles. The survey concluded that the shelter placement was a critical failure. Shelters needed to be within 100 feet of every home. That standard was rarely met. The Atkins tornado was not unique. It was a case study in a systemic problem. The problem was not the weather, it was the housing. The mobile home was designed as a temporary dwelling, but it had become a permanent solution for millions of Americans. The construction standards were weak. The enforcement was lax. The residents were vulnerable. The warnings could only do so much. The only effective protection was a sturdy building or a dedicated safe room. The cost of building a safe room for every mobile home park was estimated at $3 billion. That is a large number, but it is small compared to the cost of the recovery after each disaster. The question that remains is how many more cycles of tragedy are needed before the system changes. The answer is not meteorological. It is political, it is financial, it is moral. The Atkins tornado did not change the country. It changed only that one park. The park now has a shelter 50 feet away. The park now has a manager who drills every month. But the park is an exception. Most parks are still waiting. Most residents are still hoping. The next tornado will test their hope. In 2019, a new study was published. It looked at the fatality rates for mobile home residents during tornadoes from 2000 to 2008. The study found that the risk of dying in a tornado is 10 times higher for people living in mobile homes than for people in site-built homes. The study also found that the gap has not narrowed. It has widened. The reason is simple. Mobile homes are not being built to withstand tornadoes. The HUD code has not been updated. The industry has resisted. The political will has not materialized. At 7:18 p.m. on February 5, 2008, the lights went out in the Atkins trailer court. The transformer was struck by debris. The phone lines went dead. The cell towers were overloaded. In the darkness, the survivors heard the roar. They felt the pressure change. They smelled the dust. They hoped. When the storm passed, they stepped out into a world that had been rearranged. The homes were gone. The trees were stripped. The cars were overturned. The bodies were in the fields. That night, the Red Cross workers handed out blankets and water. The sun rose the next morning over a landscape of rubble. The recovery began. The funerals were held. The memorial was dedicated. The names of the 14 victims were etched into a stone placed at the entrance of the park. It reads, "In memory of those we lost on February 5, 2008. The stone is still there. The park is still there. The families are still there. The risk is still there." The story of Atkins is a story of what happens when the system fails the people it is meant to protect. It is a story of warnings that arrive too late. It is a story of shelters that are too far. It is a story of homes that are too weak. It is a story that has been told many times, and it will be told again. The only question is when.